Welcome to the Determining Decades series. We are here today to talk about disasters and specifically how nature reduces disaster and how nature can save lives. I'm really glad to be able to share Sarah Newkirk's expertise with you. She is known as the Director of Disaster Resilience formally, but we like to call her the Director of Disasters internally. So she's a wonderful speaker. You'll really enjoy her. I'm Liz Harvey Roberts. I'm with you many weeks, have been for the spring. It's been a wonderful experience. I'm Chief Development Officer here in the California chapter of the Nature Conservancy. I'm going on 11 years now, so it's been a wonderful experience. And thank you so much for being here under these difficult circumstances. One of the bright spots of the winter and spring has been spending time with you, our donors, for about an hour each week. So thank you for spending time with us. Over the last few months, we've been talking about the determining decade, what we really need to do to get our planet on the right sustainable course in this next decade. And this is the second of our two series. So this is the last in the second series. And we are going to be standing up a new series for you starting in August or early September. Stay tuned for that. It's going to be called Places We Protect. It'll have a similar format, but we're also going to incorporate some other special video effects and have you be able to look at those beautiful places that we protect throughout California. So I think you'll enjoy it, but we would definitely want to hear from you about places you'd like to see and stories that you'd like to hear about. So please, we're going to send out a survey at the end. It would be great to hear from you about that. And before we get started, I just wanted to answer a question that some have. What is the worst disaster? So disasters in general are terrible, we know that, but what's the worst one? So all the natural disasters took a vote to see which was the worst. Hurricane blew the others away. Earthquake shook things up pretty badly. Flooding was a bit of a wash. Blizzard almost buried the rest. Sinkholes campaign totally collapsed. Meteor made a deep impact, but in the end, avalanche won by a landslide. So a little bit of disaster humor there. Some of us have been in avalanches. Many of us have heard about them and how terrible they are. And of course, we know that landslides here in California are a terrible problem, especially during the rainy season. So with that, I would like to just give you a little bit of instruction as we interact with Sarah. Many of you have been with us before, so you know the drill. We have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, so please type in your questions as Sarah makes her presentation. We're going to get to as many as we can, and those that we can't, we'll send out answers to those questions in a couple days after Sarah has a chance to give us the answers. So please, we encourage you to say whatever is on your mind about the topic, and we definitely want this to be as interactive as possible. So with that, I'm going to introduce Sarah Newkirk, our Director of Disaster Resilience. So Sarah, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to the Conservancy, and then we can just get started.
Thanks so much, Liz, and thanks to everybody for being here today and for your interest in what we have to say about our disaster resilience strategy. I'm especially grateful. These are incredibly strange times, and I appreciate the time spent here today on this webinar. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and how I came to do this work in a minute, but before I do, I want to start by painting a picture. Imagine yourself in the early morning in the fall in your community in the Sierra foothills. You're in your kitchen, you've just made your first, maybe your second cup of coffee. It's before 7 o'clock in the morning. And you breathe in the air and you immediately know that something is wrong. It's 6:30 in the morning in Paradise, California on November 8th, 2018, and the campfire has just ignited in the nearby community of Pulgra. By 9:17, the entire town of Paradise had been ordered to evacuate, but because of the layout of the town and the roads leading out of the town and the sheer number of people that had to evacuate incredibly quickly, the full evacuation of Paradise was impossible. during this time, 120 people sheltered in place in a park called Billy Park in Paradise. Because of the special open space management of Billy Park, these people were safe from the fire while it raged around them. It literally saved their lives. And as Paradise is now rebuilding in the wake of the campfire, the town is asking itself what the Billy Park experience can teach us as we rebuild. And our disaster resilience strategy is doing the same thing. We're asking, how can we deploy open space and the risk-reducing power of nature to help our communities be safer and adapt to climate change? The title of this webinar now is Nature Saves Lives, Reducing Disaster Risk with Nature, because nature does save lives, as Billy Park taught us. I'm going to spend this talk telling you about the opportunity afforded to us by this unique moment in time. We can ask ourselves how disasters are fundamentally changing the way we think about building in our communities. And I'm going to show you how, through science, finance, and policy, we're convincing communities and federal agencies to invest in the life-saving power of open space. Disaster risk is a global phenomenon, with more disasters happening and being worse and worse of an impact. Just as an example, almost the minute the California wildfire season ends, Australia's wildfire season begins, with eerie similarities in the impacts on nature and people. TNC is uniquely positioned with our 50 state chapters and 79 chapters around the world to have incredible impact at scale. I started my career at the Nature Conservancy in New York, and I still maintain strong East Coast connections. Our team is heavily integrated throughout the North America region, and we work with our government relations partners, our partners and sister chapters sharing best practices, and in cultivating and training partners on the ground. Now back to me and why I do this work. Disaster resilience is a new name, but it's not a new concept for the Nature Conservancy. This hurricane started in August 2005. It's Hurricane Katrina. And when it hit, it made landfall in the southeastern and Gulf states, it devastated communities to an unprecedented, at the time, unprecedented degree. Coincidentally, I started my career at the Nature Conservancy in October 2005, just a month and a half after Hurricane Katrina. Prior to that, I was a consulting attorney with groups like the Ocean Conservancy and NRDC, but we knew we couldn't litigate our way out of these problems. So when I started in October 2005, we spent a lot of time mulling over the significance of Katrina. And we strongly concluded that it was going to be a game changer in how communities interact with the coast and the forces in the ocean. Suffice to say, it wasn't a game changer. And since that time, we've watched after disaster has impacted community after community, and they've rebuilt in place bravely, if not always wisely. And this isn't a random phenomenon. Our policy not only enables this, but subsidizes it. So after the 2017 storm year and the 2018 fire year, particularly powerful occurrences, TNC recognized the need to be much more direct about using nature to break the disaster cycle. So disaster resilience is another way of talking about climate change adaptation, because disasters are the most powerful impact of climate change on our communities. And we're already seeing this impact today. Our fire season is 75 days longer than it used to be. And by 2050, we can expect the 100-year flood event to be 100 times more likely in some places in California. And it's easy to forget, I know it's summer and it's wildfire season now, but California is a flood-prone state, so this is really important. By 2050, we also expect that there will be 200,000 more people living in the sea level rise and coastal flood zone. Now, 2050 is not the remote future. This is within the life of a 30-year mortgage. So these impacts will impact assets that we own now, people that we care about, and things that we care about. So this is the disaster cycle, because it is a cycle. The occurrence of a disaster in your community doesn't confer immunity to future disasters. They're repetitive, they're predictable, repetitive, and getting worse with climate change. So the cycle here reflects the fact that climate change is either a little by little phenomenon or an all at once phenomenon. In the little by little phase, illustrated here in the recovery and mitigation stages, there is time to reflect, to plan, and to be strategic. In contrast, in the all at once phase, this response and recovery phase, there's urgency with a greater willingness and greater resources to act. And that's why TNC thinks that we need to act through nature in both the recovery and the mitigation and risk reduction phases to break the cycle. So disasters can restructure communities. What I'm about to say is really critical, so pay attention. We're at a unique moment where there are three powerful forces, and there really are few forces that are powerful enough to completely force a rethinking in how we structure our communities. We're experiencing three of them right now. The first, obviously, is COVID. That's forcing us to rethink where we live, where we work, and how we may work where we live. The second is homelessness and social equity. That's forcing us to think about how for years and years there have been unequal access to the fundamental necessities of life, like housing. The last is disasters. And in disasters, we're recognizing that there are some places where we've already put development or we're planning to put development that are simply not safe. So this is really profound stuff. The age of willy-nilly development is over. There are simply too many parameters to be considered, and we must be much more cognizant of these things as we design our communities. The rest of this talk will be about how nature can play a role in the structuring of modern communities for resilience. So unfortunately, many communities are already restructuring after disasters, but it's not necessarily strategic. Since 1990, FEMA has bought 40,000 homes, usually in the aftermath of a storm, in 39 states and 3 US territories. But these buyouts are usually only benefiting the recipient. In 34% of these cases, the buyouts stay in vacant lots, as illustrated in the right-hand picture on the slide here. We know that buyouts can do much, much more. Through science, we've shown that by aggregating them and restoring the natural values of the underlying land, we can significantly multiply the impact of buyouts. So, and really the science foundation of this strategy has already been laid. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, some TNC scientists got together and did a study that showed that coastal wetlands in the northeastern United States actually saved $625 million in damage that otherwise would have been done to communities. This is an overall reduction in losses of 10% throughout the northeastern United States. And in the fire community, in the fire context, we're seeing similar things. We already know through the Billy Park example that open space and natural areas provide mustering opportunities for communities and staging areas for firefighters when they're acting in the context of these disasters. But can they be buffers as well, like these coastal wetlands? We've seen anecdotal evidence of this. You've probably seen news images of the fire burning right up to the margin of a vineyard or right up to the margin of an orchard and then being stopped in its tracks. We're taking that anecdotal evidence and working with scientists to establish whether these open space and managed open space areas can provide the same sort of buffer benefit as wetlands and floodplains do. So the challenge here is enormous. Climate change is making disasters worse, and we're still growing into risky areas as though nothing at all is happening. Have you heard of the WUI? It's not just what ghosts say, it's the wildland-urban interface. And 1/3 of Californians live at the wildland-urban interface. It's the place where nature and people come together and exist together most intimately. Unfortunately, 75% of the structures that are destroyed in wildfires are in the WUI, or the wildland-urban interface. And I said before, California is a flood-prone state, and 20% of Californians live in a floodplain. This exposes them to risk, as well as $580 billion worth of structures that are vulnerable to flooding. And in the sea level rise context, by 2050, scientists expect that 600,000 Californians will be living in the coastal flood zone. exposing $150 billion worth of property to sea level rise and coastal flooding. But to the extent that the challenge is enormous, the opportunity is huge too. Big money flows with disaster. A disaster supplemental package is an appropriation that Congress passes every time FEMA's recovery budget exceeds its annual budget. And while 81, and by the way, that happens actually pretty frequently. 10 out of the last 14 years, Congress has passed a disaster supplemental. $81 billion, as pictured here in this slide, is actually on the high side, but it's not at all unusual for FEMA to be spending $12 billion in hazard response, recovery, and mitigation. To put that into context with other agencies that we work with to get funds for conservation and restoration, compare it with the $68 million restoration budget that the US Fish and Wildlife Service has access to. $65 million is NOAA's annual budget for all its coastal and ocean restoration programs, and $65 million represents the National Park Service annual stewardship budget for all the national parks across the country. What this means is that by aligning disaster resilience and conservation, we could create a game changer for conservation funding. So our disaster resilience strategy in California has three basic pillars. We work on the ground with partners on demonstration projects to show actions that can be used to deploy nature to reduce risk. We work to develop innovative finance approaches to fund disaster resilience. And we work with state and federal lawmakers and policymakers to scale the impact beyond our demonstration sites. So with the balance of this talk, I'm going to show you how we work with each of these threads and knit them together to take advantage of this incredible opportunity at this unprecedented moment in time. So what's neat about this strategy is it actually brings together three of the Nature Conservancy's global priorities. We advance the Build Healthy Cities priority by working with nature to bring about safer and more resilient urban design. We advance the Protect Land and Water strategy by bringing big streams of federal funding to conserving open space and restoring floodplains. And we advance the Tackle Climate Change strategy by bringing around urgency to our climate adaptation approaches. So the first demonstration project is one I've already highlighted in the introduction to this talk. It's in Paradise, California. And the thing to know about Paradise is that many of the people that were driven out by the campfire are not coming back. And the risk that that creates is that developers and speculators will move in and gobble up burned lots and rebuild on them, putting new people in harm's way. When we heard about the Billy Park experience, we called up the Paradise Recreation and Parks District that owns and manages Billy Park. And we talked about their experience, and what we quickly found out is that TNC and the Paradise Recreation and Parks District shared the same ideas on how to repurpose burned lots and perhaps aggregate them to create bigger and better resilient parks for Paradise. We entered into a formal MOU with the district to help them prioritize their response actions. And under this MOU, we're doing three things. We're using science to optimize their acquisition strategy for risk reduction. We're helping them gain access to big federal funding streams for hazard risk reduction. And we're translating their on-the-ground experience in town into state and federal policies on fire risk reduction. So from the Sierra foothills to coastal Southern California, my next demonstration project that I'd like to highlight is in Ormond Beach. If you saw Sandy Matsumoto's presentation last week, you'll have heard about the Fox Canyon Groundwater Market Program. And this reflects their number of priorities coming together in Ventura County. It really is a unique place, which is why TNC has been invested there for so long. It's really special in the way that nature and people exist together in very close proximity to LA. So Ormond Beach is at the coast of Ventura County, and it's adjacent to the demographically disadvantaged town of Oxnard. Oxnard's shores has suffered a legacy of industrial land uses over the decades. And you can see in the left-hand slide, it's the home of 2 power plants, a Superfund site, wastewater treatment facilities, and so forth. But in spite of these industrial land uses, the Nature Conservancy, the State Coastal Conservancy, and the city of Oxnard have sort of looked beyond this industrial blight and seen the opportunity for restoration underneath. Together, over the years, we've conserved over 600 acres of coastal habitat and buffer against sea level rise. And we're in the process of finalizing a public access and restoration plan that will create a unique recreation resource for the disadvantaged communities in South Oxnard, as well as wildlife habitat that will exist both now and in the future with sea level rise. And the Ormond Beach restoration will be the biggest restoration project, biggest coastal restoration project in Southern California. The second pillar of our strategy is innovative finance. And you've heard this theme woven throughout my talk. It's really how to leverage our big federal resources to align conservation and hazard risk reduction. One of the first things that we did when we launched our disaster resilience strategy was forge a formal partnership with FEMA. And I actually have a cooperating technical partnership with FEMA Region 9, which is where California is. And when we were discussing the partnership with them, we immediately realized that we shared the goal of shifting more of FEMA's spending from post-hazard recovery to pre-hazard recovery and spending it less on hard structures and more on nature-based approaches. Our challenge is to make this work within FEMA's approaches, within their cost-benefit analysis tool and their eligibility criteria. And we're working with them on this right now. Our second big federal partnership is with the Department of Defense. All over the country, DoD has facilities that are susceptible to both development and climate change. And we've been partnering with them to spend their REPI resources. This is the money that they use to buffer their bases against encroachment to benefit both the communities and the natural resources and protecting habitat. What's new about our partnership here, and this is again in coastal Ventura County, at the Naval Base in Ventura. What's new about this partnership is that we're working with them on how they manage their built assets on base for the first time in response to sea level rise. We've been working with them for 3 years now, bringing science and planning resources to bear. And it's important to recognize that what they're doing right now is considering how they can manage their base assets, their nearshore base assets that you're seeing here, these bunkers here, and move them back with sea level rise. And I'm going to reiterate that because it's really important. The Navy is going to undertake managed retreat in coastal Ventura County. So even with the big federal funds, there's not going to be enough to do all we need. And that's why we need to get private entities to mobilize their investment in nature for resilience. We started by learning from a partnership that was forged in Mexico, in Cancun at Quintana Roo. And it's an insurance industry partnership. And what happened here is that a group of hotels pooled their resources to invest in an insurance product. They took out an insurance policy on the reef in front of the hotels, the reef which protects them from coastal flooding and storms. They created a totally new insurance product, and they did it in partnership with the Nature Conservancy. So we're in California, we're working with the same group of insurers to assess the feasibility of a marsh insurance product. And we can do that either by mimicking the reef insurance product in Mexico by getting, say, tech firms in San Francisco Bay to buy an insurance policy that could support restoration of the marshes in the aftermath of a storm. Or better yet, we could get those same beneficiaries to invest in direct restoration of the marshes that could then lower their insurance premiums. So the last pillar of our strategy is policy. And I'm probably not the first one to tell you that there are only 2 types of legislation that are moving in Sacramento right now. The first is COVID response, and the second is wildfire preparation and response. And legislators are watching what we're doing in Paradise. They're asking how they can help scale how we're integrating nature into rebuilding approaches and nature into preparation for wildfire season. They're also watching our insurance industry partnership and asking questions about how the insurance marketplace consumes wildfire risk information and how new products can be turned out that leverage nature's role. These legislators are asking for our input into their bills and how they can incorporate nature into the risk reduction portfolio for California. On the federal side, it's really exciting because we have a lot of momentum. In 2018, Congress passed the Disaster Recovery Reform Act that created the BRIC program, or Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. This is tremendously significant because it reflects the first time that more of FEMA's money will be spent in preparation for disasters than in the more frenetic recovery stage. And as you can see in this quote from FEMA down here, the BRIC programs aim to categorically shift the federal focus away from reactive disaster spending toward research-supported proactive investment in community resilience. It's also critical that this is the first time ever that FEMA has been explicitly calling for nature-based projects. And TNC has FEMA's ear in this. They've turned to us as a resource, and TNC's own Sarah Murdoch from our US Government Relations Department is consulting with FEMA on developing BRIC guidelines and how FEMA is going to administer the program. She's also consulting on FEMA's mitigation action portfolio. That's the suite of example projects that FEMA's putting in front of potential applicants. And also she'll be a featured speaker in FEMA's webinar series, educating applicants about how they can leverage these funds. So to summarize, we're acting locally to produce models that scale to every state in the United States. And we're in a position as a progressive, influential state to make powerful models that translate them into policy. Our team is tightly networked throughout our sister chapters in the US and is working closely with our federal government relations partners. And FEMA is paying attention. They care what we have to say. As Rahm Emanuel famously said, never let a crisis go to waste. And this is it. This is a historic moment where three crises are converging. COVID is converging with our social equity issues and homelessness crisis, together with our disaster crisis. And all of these things are converging to force our communities to rethink how we're developed on the landscape. And this is the decade in which we need to make change from the path of the cycle of disaster, death and destruction, and rebuilding to one where we approach community development recognizing the power of nature to save lives. And in California, we're doing that by influencing the science, finance, and policy of how this happens in fire-prone landscapes, in floodplains, and at the land-sea interface. And so I want to close by leaving you with three key takeaways. The first is that disasters are awful, but they also create opportunities to make communities safer, greener, and more equitable. Second, nature saves lives. Parks and open spaces can reduce disaster risk, create habitat, and increase community resilience. And lastly, there is no such thing as pre-disastered.
Thank you, Sarah. That's wonderful. Your presentation is so inspiring to me, and it's so great to hear about how we're influencing, especially FEMA, to move resources to get ahead of the disaster rather than doing the recovery aspect as much. So very encouraging. We have a number of questions. I just want to remind people, please type in your question for Sarah, and I'm sure we'll probably be able to get to it today. And if not, we will send answers afterwards. So Andrea started off with, what about tsunamis? She might have been pointing out the fact that we did not represent tsunamis in my worst natural disaster intro, but what about tsunamis? I mean, they're a disaster, and we can definitely see how they affect coastlines. So is there any evidence of how natural solutions, nature-based solutions are helping to mitigate the effect of tsunamis?
Sure, absolutely. I classify tsunamis as among the risks that we categorize as coastal flood risk. And so and that incorporates, hurricanes. We don't generally have hurricanes in California, although the risk of them is getting greater with climate change. We do have atmospheric rivers a lot, and more and more respect generating for atmospheric rivers, as they have now a hurricane like classification system ranging from 1 to 5 based on their level of devastation. But tsunamis fall into that same category of coastal flood risk. And obviously sea level rise is bringing all the forms of coastal flooding closer and closer to our communities and closer to things that we care about.
Thank you. Katie is asking, how does clearing brush impact wildlife?
That's a really great question. And that clearing brush around homes and communities is something that we can all be doing to keep our communities safer. And it brings to mind an important point, Liz, is that none of the strategies that we're suggesting here in terms of deploying parks and open space to enhance community resilience is a replacement for some of our more traditional fire risk reduction approaches, like vegetation removal. Removing excess brush decreases the fuel load around structures and is a really important part of the overall formula for fire risk reduction, along with home hardening and retrofitting homes for more fire resilient materials or fire resistant materials. And it reflects the fact that given our new reality with climate change, we're increasingly in a position where we have to learn how to live with fire as opposed to prevent it, as we have throughout our history with Smokey the Bear and Only You Can Fight forest fires. Forest fires are a part of our landscape here in California, and we need to be protecting ourselves.
Thank you. Alex is asking, what's the normal practice for providing fire buffers? How is Paradise using these as preventative measures?
It's a great question. I'm glad that you asked it because this is really new and innovative. We have not before purposefully deployed these kinds of strategies before. When we've seen open space acting as a buffer, it's because it was there in the first place for some other reason. Billy Park wasn't put there as a resilience park. It was put there as a recreational amenity, and it's wonderful for our towns and communities to have them. What we're doing that's really innovative here is recognizing that what we've seen with Billy Park, what we've seen with the orchards in Ventura County after the Thomas fire, and with some of the vineyards in the Sonoma County fire experiences, is that these kinds of managed open spaces really do provide this incidental extra benefit that we didn't really recognize them as having before. And if we are able to recognize it and incorporate that into our community development patterns, we're going to be able to really benefit from it, in addition to the additional multiple benefits in terms of natural resources and recreational amenities. They can be buffers.
Your remark reminded me of Central Park, which is in a highly urbanized area, but how we often think of parks in town squares and in the middle of the town, but this is basically the opposite, where maybe it's smarter to put them on the outskirts and they provide that buffer. So that's interesting.
What's additional interesting point about that, Liz, is that in general, when they are placed on the buffers, the margins of the community, what they do is provide an incidental urban growth boundary, right? So that slows the development of the community into that sort of unsafe wildland urban interface zone. And even if they're not intended to be an urban growth boundary, they often produce that benefit.
Good point, good point. Okay, so we have another questioner asking, are there any communities already taking preventative measures to stop disasters? It's a big question.
Yeah, lots of them are. And, you know, in the sea level rise context, which is where the vast majority of my career has been spent, communities have been planning for climate change and sea level rise in California through our local coastal programs for a long time. California has invested sagely and with great foresight in some very, very cutting edge science and how sea level rise will touch down throughout the coast of California. And communities have invested a lot of money in planning for these impacts. What we've done less of is invested in the actual actions that we need to take in order to be resilient. We've taken some actions, but there needs to be a tremendous, again, shift of resources from reacting in the aftermath of disasters to being proactive and making ourselves ready so that we don't suffer the worst impacts of climate change. When we talk about things like managed retreat from the coastline, where we might be taking development out of the most risky areas and moving it back, we think about the paradise experience. That's certainly not a managed retreat kind of experience. That's a forced retreat experience, where the worst of climate impacts in some ways has already happened and the community is learning to respond. It would be far, far better if we were investing those resources on the front end and in recognition of the likelihood that these disasters are going to come about, and investing them on the front end, incorporating the value of nature in how we're proactively responding.
Let's get to the next one here, because they're stacking up here. Catherine is asking, she's stating, I have 61 acres meant to be 70% wildlife and 20% cows, 10% people. The Detweiler fire in 2017 devastated many acres. Could I hire someone from TNC to help me figure out best restoration or prevention? I have water, power, but no housing structure.
It's not usually what TNC does, and there are some really wonderful practitioners that are out there who are probably better positioned to provide individual level planning and advice. However, happy to answer sort of any general questions that the questioner might have. And you know, again, I really appreciate the sentiment behind the question. It's really what we all need to be thinking about. What can we be doing with our own investments to both react in the aftermath of these occurrences and be ready in the pre-storm or pre-disaster context?
Yeah. Eric is asking, do you find that after a disaster, communities are eager to rebuild as quickly and cheaply as possible, or are they willing to rebuild in a more resilient way, even if it takes longer and there are more costs involved?
Yeah, bring your mind back to the disaster cycle slide, right? So where we have, and there's almost not a lot of distinction between pre-disaster and post-disaster when you reflect on the fact that it's a cycle. I think the answer to the short answer to the question is that communities are more likely to act in the aftermath of a disaster than at the front end, because it's very easy to become complacent, even when you're a community that's actually experienced something. Not for nothing, there is no such thing as pre-disaster. And just because it's happened, it's in fact likely that it will happen again in the same place. But disaster amnesia is really a thing. It doesn't take very long for a community to forget about what it feels to have the worst thing happen, and to be ready to put things back where they are. And it's human nature. When a kid builds a sandcastle in the sandbox and some bully comes and wipes it away, who's going to say to that kid, well, maybe given all the factors here, it's not the safest place to put your building? Nobody says that, right? It's human nature to want to come back and come back stronger and put our thing, get back to normal as quickly as we can. But the definition of insanity is to do the same thing again and again and expect a different outcome. And that's why what we need to do is bring together the time and the ability to be strategic and thoughtful that we have in the pre-disaster context, together with the resources that we have in the recovery and mitigation stages. Bring those things together to have that sage planning be what informs the reaction after the next disaster.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking personally of a place like Malibu, where you have the sea level rise issue and you have fire in a very contained space in very desirable, highly valuable properties. So what are we seeing communities like that do, where they're just, they might not have as many retreat options? How are they responding?
There's a lot of resistance in a lot of communities, and maybe I've seen some of this in the news. There's a lot of resistance in communities to the idea of moving. But I think that what people don't realize is that climate change adaptation and disaster resilience is not either on or off. It's a process that happens over hopefully a long period of time if you are able to avoid the worst of the disasters. And that if communities are smart, they can start their planning now and engage in in a series of steps leading up to the ultimate climate change adaptation strategy that happens sometime later. We're investing in some economic studies that will help communities recognize that there are even financial resources and legal tools at their disposal, things like reverse mortgages or life estates, that people can be taking these things out on their property right now, so that not only are they able to take interim steps that allow them to live there as long as they possibly can, but then at the end, if it becomes necessary to retreat, they can actually get out the value of their real estate investment in addition to being safe.
Well, I welcome anyone that lives in Malibu to talk to us about donating their property to the Nature Conservancy. Okay, we have another question. How big is the demand for coral and reef insurance? What is TNC doing to promote this?
It's such an exciting project, isn't it? And the answer is that it's brand new. And so we don't really know. The product was really just rolled out literally a couple of months ago. The insurers are really excited. What's interesting about this is that I think that what we hear about the insurance community, the insurance industry, most frequently in the news is that the insurers are abandoning us, right? They're leaving us to our own devices. There's this market signal that we shouldn't be in these places. I myself got a notice from my home insurer just the other day that they're not going to renew our policy and I need to find somebody new. But what's interesting about the insurance industry is that it's not monolithic. There are quite a few creative industry members that are always looking to fill new niches, right? And so to the extent that these disasters are creating sort of a new and different marketplace for insurance products, there are people looking to innovate with partners like the Nature Conservancy to create new products, sometimes on natural resources that take advantage of these openings in the marketplace. And so the answer to the question is we'll find out. Hopefully the demand for it will be great. I think it will.
And I know that we've done a lot of study with insurance companies like Munich Re in the Caribbean, and also some tools are available for making those kind of cost-benefit analysis in Indonesia and in the Coral Triangle, et cetera. So yeah, it's very interesting to see how the concept is going global.
It really is, and how the function of the natural resource is really diverse in terms of the natural resources that provide that safety buffer.
Yeah. Sorry for the dog barking. Dale is asking, how does TNC address sensitive species and habitat considerations in building nature resilience for communities?
The Nature Conservancy obviously is driven by a mission to protect wildlife and the lands and waters on which it depends. In our disaster resilience strategy, when we're talking about locating these parks in communities, it's typically not endangered species habitat at all. I mean, we're really looking at ways to reduce development impacts. So this is already an impacted landscape. It's not necessarily a fully wild landscape. And really this is integral to our approach with cities is how can we, maybe these are not fully functional, fully wild ecosystems, but they do provide tremendous biodiversity benefit. Our scientists on our urban team have showed that parks and urban landscapes provide a tremendous wildlife benefit. And so we're certainly not impacting the recovery of endangered species. With our work in places like Ormond Beach, where we've already conserved 600 plus acres of endangered species habitat where we have western snowy plovers and other birds living there. We're working to restore those places so that those species can thrive.
Excellent. Okay, Todd is asking, on that question about clearing brush, would forest thinning and grazing help with reducing fire risk and offer a sustainable approach?
We have to be really careful about our forestry practices. We have at TNC a whole separate team that is our forest team, and they have some very science-based approaches to ecological forest management. I'm not an expert in ecological forest management, so I'm reluctant to answer the question with any kind of specificity because my area of expertise is in the wildland-urban interface, where what we're talking about is managing brush around communities.
Mm-hmm. And I remember David Edelson, who we featured in one of our earlier webinar series, speaking about just the gold rush towns and gold rush development up into the Sierra, which is, I think, part of the paradise situation where we're starting to have these just very simple road systems that go up canyons and valleys, and it provides this great corridor for fire to come from the forested areas and impact towns. So that's, we're working in the Yuba watershed to really, with Downeyville, et cetera, to try to really tackle that on a watershed scale. So more on that later. Okay, Michael is asking, and again, sorry about my dogs, how do other states, particularly conservative ones, feel towards California and TNC's progressive posture towards the projects being proposed?
What's really interesting is that disaster recovery and disaster mitigation is a bipartisan issue. I mentioned the 2018 piece of federal legislation, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. That was one of the very few big pieces of bipartisan legislation to come out of this Congress within the last handful of years. I think that we're unified around the country in the need to be better prepared for natural disasters and better able to recover from them. And we're even seeing alignment across the states, whether they be red states or blue states, in the role that nature can play. We recognize that nature has a fundamental role to play in our overall risk mitigation portfolio, and we want to invest and recognize that. Yeah, I mean, we work with our chapter. I work very closely with our South Carolina chapter, where they have I think a big sort of voter initiative that they're working on resilience. What's interesting in those states is they don't always call it climate change adaptation, and that's fine. You know, we can call it disaster resilience or climate change adaptation. Whatever it is, it's good for people and nature.
And just as a note for our donor audience, we have a task force internally made up of donors who have donor advised funds with some of the largest institutions. And we are working to elevate the Nature Conservancy's profile within those institutions and really around disaster mitigation. Because as we know, a lot of times people are very generous in their responses to disasters when they strike, and they rely on their donor advised fund sponsor to provide a tool and conduit information about how they can respond. And so we are trying to communicate about our disaster mitigation work and our climate resilience work so that those donor advised fund sponsors have the information at the ready to give to their donors who have funds with them. So we are trying at many angles to heighten both the Nature Conservancy's profile, as well as just get the word out that nature does save lives, and nature is a great solution to a lot of the disasters that will continually happen. So I'm going to ask, we probably have time for maybe 1 to 2 more questions. So why don't I get on with that? Macaria is asking, how is the Nature Conservancy helping or informing the community at Newport and or the Malibu area?
We don't have, while we don't have specific projects in those areas, we work very closely with the California Coastal Commission. And we work very closely, one of our big projects is a project with the community of Long Beach, the peninsula in Long Beach, where there's a tremendous river flooding impact and a coastal flooding impact that may come together and get worse over the years. What we're doing in Long Beach is trying to uncover ways of productively working with communities. Communities, especially in Southern California, have been really resistant to some of the approaches that the Coastal Commission has been deploying to really try to force communities to rethink the way they live in and build along the coastline. And what we're trying to do is uncover ways to have a civil dialogue within a community-driven civil dialogue on what they want their own future to look like. We're bringing tools to bear like virtual reality so that communities can better visualize not only the impact of sea level rise and flooding on their resources, but also what the solution set can look like when it's laid out on the landscape. And we're really learning a lot about what communities need to know in order to appropriately plan. As I said before, they don't want to skip to the end. They don't want to skip to the managed retreat scenario. They want to talk about the steps that can be taken in the interim to allow them to live in their homes for as long as possible. And I think that the lessons that we're learning in Long Beach will be applicable in other Southern California communities as well, perhaps like Malibu and like Newport Beach. But I do think that events like the recent flood in Newport Beach tend to mobilize community sentiment to take action and think more seriously about these problems.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. And I think that's going to be our last question. I know that we have several in the queue, and we will get back to you in a few days with answers. So thank you so much for being active participants with us this morning. So I want to thank Sarah so much for your expertise and your passion around this issue. And I want to thank all of you for being with us. And just to say, we're concluding this second series of webinars. We'll stand up the next one in late August, early September. So please look in your email for that. And again, we just really appreciate your support and your presence with us during this very unusual period of time. So look for the survey, please answer it, give us some more ideas about what you'd like to hear about. And we thank you very much. Have a great day. Bye.